Welcome back to another edition of the MintCast, the podcast by Mint Press News. This show is made possible by supporters like you, and we're currently doing our yearly funding campaign right now on Indiegogo. So if you are in an economic position, please do go to Indiegogo and support us. And with that, let's go on with the show. Now, the United States is addicted to war. It spent 229 of its 247 years of existence in some kind of conflict. Controlling a worldwide network of over 800 military bases, it has, according to a congressional report, carried out 251 foreign military interventions since the end of the Cold War in 1991. And even as occupations like Afghanistan end, new enemies are always on the horizon, justifying continued military spending. Our guest today is Lindsay Koshgarian, the program director at the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, a progressive think tank in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the show, Lindsay.
Thanks for having me, Alan.
Yeah, well, the pleasure's mine. You're the lead author of a new report called The Warfare State: How Funding for Militarism Compromises Our Welfare, a report that I found shocking, fascinating, but perhaps not surprising at the same time. I think a lot of people know that the military and military spending in general is very high in the US, but some of your findings are just eye-popping, like, for example, of the $1.8 trillion federal discretionary budget for 2023, 1.1 trillion, or 62%, went to purchasing weapons for our military or to militarizing the police or the prison systems. Can you tell us a bit more about that report?
Yes. So the discretionary budget in the U.S. is our starting point, and it's important to look at because it's the source of funding for most federal programs. So the discretionary budget, as you said, is about $1.8 trillion. That is a lot of money, hard for most of us to imagine. But that pot of money is responsible for funding the federal government's programs for the military, is where most of it goes, but also for what is referred to as Homeland Security and law enforcement, but also for public education, public housing programs, affordable housing programs, anti-homelessness programs, public health. Many, many other areas of federal programs are dependent on this budget for their funding. So it was important to us to be able to see what the priorities in this budget are and how much of the funding is available for things that build communities like public health or public education versus how much goes into the military and militarization. And as you said, what we found is that more than 60%, 62% of this budget most recently has gone to militarization. And so that includes things like the Pentagon and nuclear weapons. It includes the militarization of our borders, which has taken place increasingly over the last 20 years with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. It includes our huge law enforcement system, and the U.S. has still the highest rate of incarceration of any developed country in the world. So it goes toward that. All of these things and sort of dealing with our problems through violence or the threat of violence is where 62% of that budget is going. And what that means is that less than, just about $1 in $3 from that budget are available for all of those other things. And for things that would, in fact, actually decrease the need or the perceived need for militarization and those kind of solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I know that these sorts of numbers, 100 billion this, 1 trillion that, make a lot of people's eyes glaze over. It's not really relevant to people, these sorts of huge figures. But I wanted to put that into perspective for ordinary people. And thankfully, that's what you did in in a different report, actually, released on Tax Day this year, which breaks down exactly where American tax dollars go. If you include veterans' benefits in the war section, then Americans spend more on war than anything else, even healthcare. It was extraordinary to see that in that report, the average American taxpayer gave over $1,000 to Pentagon contractors this year, which is around 4 times as much as they spent on public education K through 12. I guess this is what the National Priorities Project is all about, highlighting how much military spending is holding back American society in so many other ways.
That's right. And like you said, it's hard for most of us to understand numbers like trillions. It's not those aren't numbers that we deal with in our daily lives, and it's hard to understand what those things mean. But like you said, we do put together an income tax receipt every year for U.S. taxpayers to show them where their tax dollars are going. And you talked about spending on veterans, and even though we wouldn't want to decrease veterans' benefits, we think that U.S. veterans are due all of the benefits that they receive and more. The reason that our costs are so high for our veterans programs, and the costs for our veterans programs are now 3 times what they were 20 years ago. And the reason for that is because we send so many people to war. And then they come back and they have, higher medical needs. They have higher needs for social support and employment support and things like that. And that's why we spend so much money on those things. So yes, what we find is that when you look at your income taxes, the average person is paying over $2,300 a year for our military, plus another $700 plus for veterans. So that's over $3,000. And just to put that in some other perspective, that's more than twice what the median rent is for a 2-bedroom apartment in this country. So we're talking about really big parts of, a couple months of rent for most people, or a couple months of a mortgage. It's a really significant expense for individual taxpayers. And that's what we wanted people to kind of get a sense of.
Yeah, and you've got some great little pictures and graphs in that report. It's very accessible. It's not like a lot of reports that think tanks put out, which are generally unreadable. One of the things I found from that was that out of every dollar of taxes Americans pay, nearly a quarter goes to the permanent war economy, as compared to less than a nickel on food and agriculture, 2 cents on housing and community projects, and less than a penny on energy and the environment. And some more jaw-dropping findings from that report, which I should have mentioned is called Tax Day 2023, where your 2022 tax dollars went, is just how much money goes to certain companies even. So, for example, the average American gave one company, military giant Lockheed Martin, $106 in their taxes this year. And the government spent around $74 of your taxes on nuclear bombs alone. And this is in comparison to just $11, for example, on anti-homelessness projects, which quite often are flawed to begin with, frankly, in their outlook and what their solutions are towards homelessness, or just $6 to develop renewable energy as well. And so I think this really goes to show that the age-old question that progressives face of how will we pay for it actually seems quite obvious, doesn't it?
Yes. And that is another big reason that we put together all of these reports, is because we're so used to hearing from politicians that we can't possibly afford things like universal health care, or that we can't possibly afford to transition fully away from fossil fuels. And so this really does put the lie to that. I think one of the most striking examples, as you said, is less than $7 is what the average taxpayer paid for renewable energy. Now that number will go up some because of the Inflation Reduction Act, but in 2022, it was less than $7 per taxpayer that you were contributing to renewable energy. And, this summer we're seeing there are floods, there are wildfires, there's wildfire smoke. Most people, in the United States have been affected by one of these things. And we're seeing that we're just not putting the money into solving the climate crisis. But we are, as you said, putting the money into these military contractors. And just to be clear, that money is not for our security. That money is largely unnecessary. There have been reports recently. There was a 60 Minutes CBS report earlier this year that pointed to price gouging by Pentagon contractors, where they were overcharging the government. There was one example where a company sold a small piece of equipment to the Pentagon for $10,000, and they had sold the exact same piece of equipment to NASA for less than $400. So the price markups are just out of control. And then, of course, there are our wars, where the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan after more than 20 years. But we spent trillions of dollars on those wars over the last 20 years, and they were completely unnecessary, cost millions of lives, and trillions of dollars for us. So a lot of this spending that we're doing on these weapons contractors and on the Pentagon is not necessary for our security.
Yeah, I think it really gives you a sense of the priorities of the federal government seeing these figures. So while, as you said, they spend thousands per person on war and militarism, they're really, yeah, I mean, they're throwing less than what a Subway sandwich costs at things like climate programs, which are desperately needed to avert the worst of catastrophic climate change, which, sometimes we're seeing this summer. And so every time that someone like, for instance, Bernie Sanders comes along, with a policy that might aid ordinary people, such as student debt relief or Medicare for all, every single columnist in the Washington Post or wherever suddenly seems that feels the need to write some sort of "how will we pay for it" article. And yet, at the same time, the military budget, already by far the largest in the world, seems to increase every year, and no one objects. In fact, last year I saw the Washington Post published an article with the title Biden has requested an increase in defense spending. It's not nearly enough. Which leads me to the question I wanted to ask you. Why do you think there's a sort of near total consensus among the political class when it comes to military spending?
Yeah, there is a disturbing consensus. I'd like to first point out that it is not a total consensus. There are voices that are calling for reason in our Pentagon budget. And some of those are Representatives Barbara Lee and Representative Mark Pocan in the House of Representatives just introduced a vote to cut the Pentagon budget by $100 billion, which would be a little more than a 10% cut. It did not receive a vote in the House of Representatives. Senator Bernie Sanders introduced a similar amendment to cut the Pentagon budget by 10%. It did receive a vote, only got 11 senators to vote for it. So those are the kinds of levels of support that we're working with right now, even though a similar amendment a couple of years ago got more than 20 votes. So it depends somewhat on the circumstances, but there are voices even inside Congress that are challenging this budget. And I think that's important for people to know because that is the area where we have to work from in order to start to change that. But why there are so many members of Congress who and members of the mainstream media who continually support these spending levels. One of the biggest reasons is that they are receiving regular attention and visits from the arms industry. So you have, as you mentioned, the average taxpayer is giving over $100 a year to Lockheed Martin, which is the biggest weapons contractor. There are hundreds of lobbyists working Congress from the arms industry. They are roaming the halls. They are telling members of Congress about their support. They are asking them to raise military budgets and to protect budgets for weapons systems that they have an interest in. They are giving campaign contributions. So there's a whole ecosystem of lobbyists and this arms industry that's very cozy with Congress and with the White House, regardless of which party is in power. So that is one of the biggest reasons why this continues to be a problem. And in terms of media, there was a fascinating study that was done by Ben Friedman at the Quincy Institute, who's now at the Quincy Institute, showing that in mainstream coverage of the Ukraine war, 3/4 almost of the experts who were quoted in media articles were at think tanks that were funded by the arms industry. So that is a serious conflict of interest in terms of who those people are representing and what viewpoints we're going to be hearing in the media. So a lot of it comes back to the massive amounts of money that the arms industry is pouring into this. And of course, remember that a company like Lockheed Martin gets upward of 80% of its revenues from the federal government. So it is our tax dollars that they are taking and turning around to lobby our government and to make campaign contributions and to fund experts that are then appearing in news articles that don't mention where the funding is coming from.
Yeah, it's just an extraordinary situation. And I think if it was happening in an enemy country, we would describe it as just a blatantly corrupt system whereby these huge military companies, you named many of them, I'll name some others, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, etc., are funneling gigantic sums of money into the political system. If you go somewhere like Washington, D.C., you might even see commercials for companies like Raytheon and Boeing and General Dynamics actually playing in local markets. And that's not because anyone in DC is actually thinking, oh, hey, I need to buy a Patriot missile or something. It's actually because they can target policymakers just like that. And as you said, they actually, literally knock on doors with these lobbyists that are paid for, bought and paid for They're there to amp up this military budget all the time. Another thing you touched on as well is how these companies are really parasitic. They have these extraordinary profits that they turn out year on year. Companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon just give out fantastic sums of money to their shareholders. But where's that money coming from? Ultimately, it's coming from the US taxpayers. They're not selling most of these products to local industries. And we've got a situation in the US now where so much of the country is kind of falling apart. The bridges, the roads, all the infrastructure is really aging. And yet, one place in the US which is seeing, a fantastic development is this ring of towns and cities around Washington, D.C., which is collectively known as Raytheon Acres. I'm thinking of places like Bethesda, Maryland, or somewhere like that, where if you go there, there's just full of these quote unquote non-governmental organizations who are just there, leeching money off the government, telling them, how to organize their wars better. Or we've got, companies like, as I said, these big arms companies there who are making out like bandits right now, and it's just extraordinary that this is just allowed to continue.
Yes, that's right. We know that these massive corporations that are the largest military contractors in this country, they're paying their CEOs multi-million-dollar salaries. The top 5 weapons contractors had CEO pay that totaled over $100 million recently. That's from taxpayer money. They are engaging in stock buybacks, which other corporations also do, where they buy their own stocks in order to just drive up the price. And they're engaging in that using taxpayer money. So there's all of the things that we think about when we think about corporate corruption are also happening in the arms industry, but it is the rare industry that is majority taxpayer funded. So they're engaging in all of that corporate corruption with our tax dollars.
Most definitely. And it goes all the way to the top as well. For instance, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was on the board of one of these gigantic military companies before. And I think there's a real sort of intersection between military and government there. I mean, many years ago, the New York Times writer, Thomas Friedman, not someone I often quote favorably, he said, McDonald's couldn't exist without McDonnell and Douglas. And what he meant was American businesses couldn't really take over the globe like they have if it wasn't for the power of the American military. And, sometimes a broken clock is right. And I'll give Thomas Friedman his due there.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that one before. And I also don't frequently quote Thomas Friedman, but that's about right. And I think that's where, it ties back into remembering that the reason we're pouring so much money into the military and into the military industrial complex is not just about security. We are pouring that money in order to maintain U.S. power, in order to maintain the power of U.S. corporations. So there's a lot there that is, not just about our security, not about the security of, people living in the United States or the integrity of the security and integrity of our land here, but about more maintaining U.S. power on the world stage in a way that, by way of denying power to other countries, which also, if you think about it, is a fundamentally anti-democratic way of operating.
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. Now, we've talked a lot about the tremendous waste of money that the Pentagon is, but you at the IPS have come up with some, I think, quite very modest proposals of a small cut of around $100 billion to the budget, which, as you said, some congresspersons and senators have even endorsed. That would really just be, trimming it to around what the 2018 budget for the military was. Could you tell us what America could do with that money? What could $100 billion fund?
Yes. So this is one of the proposals that we've worked on. We've actually proposed cutting as much as $350 billion per year from the military budget. And in a 2019 report and in an op-ed in the New York Times, I also laid out exactly how we could do that, which weapons systems we would cut, how much the size of our forces would need to go down. There is actually some support from within Army leadership to reduce the size of the Army, reduce the number of troops in the Army, partly because they're having serious recruitment problems, but also because that kind of land force battle is increasingly not where Pentagon leaders expect, the future of the military to be. So a lot of our proposals have even some support from within the military itself. So there are many, many ways that we could cut spending, and we have shown how to cut up to $350 billion. But the proposals to cut $100 billion also come from, like I said, there are champions within Congress, and Representative Barbara Lee and Representative Mark Pocan have been two of the members of Congress who have introduced legislation to cut $100 billion from the Pentagon budget. And one important thing to know about that is that those cuts would come entirely from the military and military contractors themselves. They would not cut troops' pay. They would not cut troops' benefits. So some of the things that people might be concerned about in terms of supporting the troops, those are not an issue in this proposed cut of $100 billion. It would be very easy to cut $100 billion by cutting unnecessary weapons systems, by cutting back on some of that excess corporate profit that we talked briefly about. So there are lots of ways to do this. And as you said, one of the things that we do is talk about ways that we could spend that $100 billion and what we could do with that money. And so some of the examples of that are that folks may remember that when President Biden introduced his Build Back Better initiative, originally it was much bolder than what it eventually passed Congress. But $100 billion would be more than enough to fund the original clean energy and childcare provisions of the Build Back Better plan. So that's universal childcare, which is something that is sorely lacking in this country. If you ask anyone with young children, they'll tell you that childcare is hard to find and unaffordable. And we're very unusual in that respect among developed countries. It would be enough to power every household in the United States with solar energy, which, as you can imagine, would make a huge dent in our carbon emissions. $100 billion could hire 1 million elementary school teachers. And this is another thing that got worse during the pandemic, where there is a shortage of school teachers and people who have left the profession, and we need more of them. So those are just a few of the things that we could do with $100 billion. So this could make a huge difference to communities across the country just by cutting some unnecessary weapons systems and making some changes to the way that corporations are allowed to profit from this.
Yeah, I always say that every penny spent on a bullet is taking food from a hungry child's mouth ultimately. And it really is a zero-sum game in some ways. And that report was incredible because some of the other things that you had in there was provide free tuition for 2 out of every 3 public college students in the US. $100 billion could send every household in the US a $700 check, for instance. Or you could hire nearly 900,000 registered nurses, or you could cover medical care for 7 million veterans as well. So the possibilities when you have that sort of cash at your disposal seem really endless. And in fact, the National Priorities Project actually has a trade-off calculator that anyone can use to see what the military budget could be used for. For example, I was using that earlier, and I saw that the military budget for 1 year would be enough to create 21 million American jobs doing whatever we decided was useful. So that could be rebuilding America, addressing the climate crisis, addressing systemic racism, all sorts of problems with transport. Again, the possibilities are endless. Or we could give out 25 million 4-year scholarships to good universities, or provide half the planet with solar or wind electricity as well. So yeah, just extraordinary the sorts of savings that we could make here.
Yeah, thank you for pointing out our calculator. One of the great things about that calculator is it's used by activists a lot because you can calculate these kinds of trade-offs. If you cut the military budget by this much, you could hire this many teachers or this many nurses, or get this much solar power for this many houses, or a number of other things like the things that you talked about. But one of the really powerful things you can do with it is actually look up your own city or town or congressional district, so that if you're writing a letter to the editor of a local paper, or if you're calling your member of Congress, you can have numbers that actually apply to your own city or town or to your own congressional district. And those numbers then become really even much more powerful, because instead of saying, oh, this is the whole country, and most of us don't know, if we hired 1 million teachers, what difference would that make? Is that a lot of teachers for the whole country, or is it not that many for the whole country? But locally, if you start talking about your own city, then those numbers can start to make a lot more sense. And that's one of the great things that you can do with the calculator at our website. And we, activists use that regularly, but we've also know that there are members of Congress whose staff use it regularly too, to talk about these things.
Yeah, you can also change it around to even just look at individual projects. So, for example, just for the cost of the drafted F-35 fighter, which reportedly can't really fly in the rain, the United States could have had more than 1 million public housing units, or could have hired 130,000 more elementary school teachers. This is just for one aircraft project.
Yes. There's the F-35 jet fighter. There's also the amount that we pay every year for nuclear weapons. And this one's really interesting right now for a few reasons. One is because a lot of people are thinking more about nuclear weapons with the release of the Oppenheimer movie, but also because we are right now in the midst of the days that are the anniversary of the U.S. bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are the 2 times that that nuclear weapons have been used on human beings. So it's a particularly timely time right now to think about nuclear weapons, and also because there now are some major medical journals have started to release calls to prohibit nuclear weapons. And there is, in fact, a UN treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons that went into effect a couple of years ago because enough countries signed on to it. But unfortunately, major nuclear powers like the United States have not signed on to it. So there's a real push to prohibit and abandon nuclear weapons. This is something that is more possible than people think. We've already done it with chemical weapons. There's no reason why, given the right diplomacy, yes, it would take some time. We couldn't get there with nuclear weapons as well. So that's another thing, as you can see, if we were to get to that place of prohibiting nuclear weapons and no longer had to spend those billions, what could we do with that money?
Yeah, and somebody who recently passed away, Daniel Ellsberg, was one of the big proponents of limiting or abolishing nuclear weapons. He worked for the Rand Corporation in the 1960s, and I think he wrote a book called Confessions of a Nuclear Planner, in which he was actually charged by the Pentagon with just working out war game scenarios about what would happen in certain nuclear confrontations. And he was once asked what would happen if the United States launched a complete and totally successful attack on the Soviet Union without any Soviet response whatsoever. And what he concluded was actually that the vast majority of the people in the United States would die in that situation just because of the amount of smoke that would just be generated from this nuclear conflict. It would block out the sun for perhaps a decade. Crops would fail all over the world. And yeah, the vast majority of the world would die. And that would be in the best case scenario. So these things are an absolute blight on our society. And we really have to be working towards eradicating them completely, especially because of the fact that the United States is now agitating 2 other nuclear powers in Russia and China right now.
Yes. And we've lost some of our major nuclear treaties in the last few years between the Trump administration and between Putin going off the rails. We're in a much worse place for nuclear treaties than we were. And that's a difficult problem to solve right now with the Ukraine war going on, but it actually makes it even more important to solve it before we get to the point of anyone deciding to use a nuclear weapon. And to your point, another thing that we're hearing a lot more about right now, in part because of the focus from the movie, is the downwind effects of nuclear weapons and the fact that the Trinity test, which is the first test of a nuclear weapon in New Mexico, resulted in radioactive poisoning that has caused cancers and has been felt by people living in New Mexico for all the decades since then. And it was something that was definitely not fully appreciated at the time and has not received adequate attention, but is starting to receive more attention now. And also, many years after the fact, studies that radiation, in fact, reached probably all of the continental United States from that one single nuclear test. So it really is a much bigger problem than we've given it credit for.
Yeah, if I remember rightly, I believe the scientists involved in that, in the Manhattan Project, thought there was a real non-zero chance that they would actually ignite the entire atmosphere on their first use of the atomic bomb, resulting in the world turning into a fireball. And yet they went ahead with it anyway. So there we go. And to your point, I believe hundreds of thousands of Americans actually perished as of the consequences of these nuclear tests, primarily down to this sort of fallout just going across the continental United States, infecting a cow's milk and then getting into children's blood, adults' blood, seniors' blood as well. So, yeah, I mean, we're already living with the consequences of nuclear weapons, even though they haven't been fired in anger since 1945.
Yes, and to make things worse, right now the military is gearing up for a major reinvestment in nuclear weapons, which includes things like what are called low yield nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons. These are still nuclear weapons. They're a bit smaller, but when you think back and think that to the Trinity test, that explosion turned out to be much bigger than the scientists actually expected. So a smaller nuclear weapon, these are still many times, tens of times more powerful than a typical conventional weapon. So these are not more usable. But the US military is now reinvesting in those and reinvesting in our older nuclear weapons as well, trying to take those into the 21st century. When what we really need to have is a diplomatic focus on working toward decreasing the number of nuclear weapons and then finally getting to an ultimate prohibition on nuclear weapons globally.
Yeah, if you're just joining us, we're speaking with Lindsay Koshgarian from the National Priorities Project of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. Lindsay, we were talking earlier about Biden's massive defense spending bill. There has been some pushback towards it from Republicans, but the literal Republican pushback I've seen seems to come from all the wrong places. As you wrote recently, Republican opposition to the bill appears to be focused on trying to just shoehorn culture war issues, trying to block healthcare for transgender service members or cutting off abortion for soldiers as well. Could you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Yes. So first of all, the White House and Congress have agreed on a military budget that is larger this year than it was last year by almost $30 billion. So they're looking at a big increase in military spending. And this amount of money was first requested by President Biden, but then also came out of the debt ceiling deal that happened in the spring when Republicans forced a budget agreement by threatening to essentially shut down the U.S. economy. And so already this is way too much money for the Pentagon, and we can talk about that. And the fact that, each year that 100 billion that we talked about cutting is a smaller piece of the pie because the budget overall keeps getting bigger and bigger. So there's that. That is a huge amount of money. And part of the problem is that we haven't been able to properly debate that amount of money. And we haven't been able to properly debate any number of other important military policy issues, like the fact that the authorization for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars are still on the books. There's still the legal authorization for those wars are still on the books and can be used by future presidents. So that's a big problem. But we haven't been able to adequately talk about any of that because House Republicans took a lot of the things that we're seeing in cities and states, the attacks on transgender people, the attacks on abortion rights, the attacks on diversity programs and racial equity programs, and put them into what's called the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the annual military policy bill. And so the House passed this bill. And as you said, far right members of the House forced votes and were successful on ending the use of any military funds for transgender healthcare for service members or their family members, ending the use of any military funds for any abortion care, which was something that the Biden administration had actually tried to make sure that military service members who lived in states that have made abortion illegal would be able to travel to get abortion care if they needed it. They have cut off funding for that. And they have tried to cut off funding for all of the military's diversity programs. And that includes things like anti-hazing and anti-harassment programs. It includes things like anti-extremism programs that try to identify white supremacy and white supremacists within the troops and try to address those problems. And we know that, in fact, there are a good number of people in our military who have those kinds of sympathies, white supremacist sympathies, and are actively expressing those and organizing around them. So programs like that are threatened to be cut by this House bill. Now, that hasn't become law yet. None of that has become law because the Senate version of the bill doesn't include any of that. And the House and Senate are now at a place where they need to try to reconcile that difference. But the fact that all of those things are in that bill is both alarming on its own because it means that, these sort of hate amendments that are attacking trans people, attacking women, attacking, people who are any race other than white, are all part of the House's military policy bill. That's a huge problem in itself. But it also means that they didn't allow debate or a vote on amendments to cut Pentagon spending. The House didn't allow debate or votes on amendments that would have ended the war powers for the Iraq or Afghanistan wars. So all of these really serious military questions are not being answered because of this intense focus that the far right has on their culture war amendments.
Yeah, I can only imagine looking at the military and thinking the biggest problem with it right now is that there are too many trans soldiers or something. It just seems extraordinary to me that they can look at that. And it's actually very concerning what's happened over the last couple of years, whereby Republicans, the right wing, and the far right more generally have been able to take up this mantle of being anti-war because they're saying things against, the US role in the Ukraine war, for example, which, to a certain extent, I can get behind anti-war sentiment when it comes to Ukraine. But often when the Republicans are really talking about this, people on Fox News, I'm thinking about Tucker Carlson especially, often their whole concept of this is we shouldn't be fighting Russia. We should actually be directing our forces towards China, which in my opinion would be an even bigger I'm trying to think of a word that is a little bit more, family friendly, but than the one that starts with cluster, a bigger quagmire than would be in Russia. And yet, this is the sort of stuff that passes for debate right now in Washington. It's extraordinary.
I think there's a definite need for some additional diplomacy around Ukraine, and it's been disappointing that the U.S. has not been more of a leader in that. But I fully agree with you that anti-war doesn't begin to describe the culture of politics on the right now. I mean, if you look back just to during the Trump presidency and the amount of support that there was for a military confrontation with Iran by pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal that had been successful in stopping Iran's progress toward developing a nuclear weapon. The Trump administration pulled out of that and Iran started their progress toward a nuclear weapon again. The Trump administration killed the Iranian military leader Soleimani, which was a major confrontation and provocation of Iran. And again, that is not an anti-war step. So there are many, many ways in which the right is not anti-war. Really, there are a small number of folks on the right who I would give credit for a small number of things. There has been some support for, ending the use and transfer of cluster munitions, which are bombs that tend to, for various reasons, result in massive civilian casualties. So there are some instances where people have stepped forward in helpful ways from the right. But it's overall true that I think there's not there's no demonstration that in general in politics on the right in this country that there is an anti-war sentiment, and the desire to confront China is a big part of that.
Yeah, I just wonder if all this sort of anti-war sentiment on the right will dissipate if Trump or DeSantis gets elected next year. I suspect that quite possibly a lot of this is just partisan bickering and, points winning and mudslinging, really. Yeah, we talked about national debt a little bit. The military budget is never really touched upon. So often we talk about national debt, we have to reduce the debt, reduce our deficit, and yet nobody seems to suggest actually cutting the military budget, which is one of the biggest, one of the most costly things that the US actually spends money on. Why is that? Why does nobody ever bring that up?
Well, again, I would point out that it's not nobody. We do have some champions who do bring this up, mostly folks on the left who I've mentioned before.
Yeah, I do apologize. I should say nobody except fine people at the IPS and a handful of guys in Washington. Yeah.
Well, yeah, a few people in Congress, but it's really critical that we have those people, because that is how we can kind of find our foot in the door to get more of those people. That one of the things that Representative Lee and Representative Pocan, who sponsored the $100 billion Pentagon cut amendments and legislation, one of the things they've done is to rally support from their other members of Congress around this. And obviously, they haven't built enough support yet, but having those people there to do that is really critical to these efforts. So I want to give credit where credit is due. But why we don't talk about this enough, part of it is, and I want to say this, by way of also appreciating you doing this episode today, part of it is that military cuts are not treated as a serious policy option in Washington often. And part of that is because there aren't enough people demanding that. Things are treated as not serious or not necessary in Washington frequently until there are loud enough voices demanding it. And right now, and to this date, the loudest voices in Washington, if you're a member of Congress, if you're inside Washington, the loudest voices are the voices of the arms industry, are the voices that are calling for more military spending, not less. You mentioned earlier a headline that said, this is the military budget, it's not nearly enough. Those voices are the loudest. And so what needs to happen in order for the idea of a smaller military budget to be taken seriously is that the voices calling for that need to become louder. And there are lots of folks who are working on this. There's the People Over Pentagon Coalition, which is comprised of organizations from across many different issue areas. There are climate organizations, environmental organizations, immigrant right organizations, multi-issue progressive groups like Move On. There are many different progressive groups that are a part of that coalition, and all of their voices calling for this is going to help to start to move this forward. There are groups like the Poor People's Campaign, which is a multi-issue group that operates in more than 40 states and is calling for, among many things, calling for cuts to military budgets. So all of those sort of grassroots efforts and movement efforts can start to make a difference on this. But what we really do need in order for that to become a serious part of the conversation is for those voices to be louder. And it does help that Senator Bernie Sanders just had an op-ed in The Guardian saying that this military budget is too high. So we have some of those voices inside Congress. We have some of those voices outside Congress. But what we need is more of all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote an article about this a couple of years ago for fairness and accuracy in reporting, and it seems that every time a Democrat is elected into the White House, there's all this cacophony that comes from media land about we have to reduce the debt. Let's get serious about the deficit, and they usually say, we have to, be fiscally responsible like Reagan or Bush or whoever. But when you look at their actual records, people like Reagan, Bush, and Trump, they were not at all, fiscally responsible. They passed these sweeping tax cuts for the rich, which absolutely enriched, the elite of the United States, but drained the coffers of the Treasury completely. And so this idea that the Republicans are fiscally responsible is complete nonsense. And I think the reason it comes up whenever a Democrat is elected is just in case, maybe, probably not, but perhaps the Democrat might get some sort of idea about using government money to help the poor with welfare or whatever. So often this is just used as a cudgel to roll back any already poor entitlement programs or welfare programs the United States actually has.
It's absolutely used as a cudgel to end poverty programs and end programs that help people. It's no secret that the political right in this country doesn't want to see tax dollars used to help people or to make things more equal or more fair. So absolutely, it's an excuse to cut those programs. And what we mostly see from the right is that they want to cut those programs while increasing military spending. And so that's actually what we got in the budget deal that came out of the debt ceiling standoff earlier this year. What we got was a budget deal where previously 53% of the budget had gone to, of the discretionary budget had gone to the military. And in this deal, 56% of the total went to the military. So military spending went up. Spending on non-military priorities went down, and it's even worse if you look at things that outside of veterans care, which also got a boost, or to the Department of Homeland Security, which is also militarized. So what we saw is that they were actually successful in shifting spending from programs that help people in communities to the military.
All right, Lindsay Koshgarian, I know you have to go soon, so I'll ask you one more question then. The Department of Homeland Security, which was established at the height of the War of Terror, has recently turned 20 years old. But you've been very, very critical of the organization, haven't you? You called it, and I quote, a money-guzzling failure, end quote. Could you lay out what your problem with the DHS is and what we should do about it?
Yes. So the Department of Homeland Security was founded as part of the U.S. response to 9/11. And what it is a jumble of agencies. It includes everything from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is the agency that sends out money and help when a community is hit by a hurricane or flooding or a wildfire. It includes everything from that to our border control agencies, which is the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, which does deportations inside the country, and Customs and Border Protection, which guards the border. And those two agencies, ICE and CBP, the immigration agencies, they take up a third of the budget of DHS. The spending on these programs has skyrocketed over the last 2 decades. We did not used to, as a country, spend that much on deporting people and detaining people at the border. And over that time, what it has done is it has torn apart immigrant communities. We have deported 5 million people over the last 20 years. The vast majority of them did nothing wrong other than be in the country, come into the country. And our immigration system is broken. So when we talk about DHS being a money guzzling failure, that is primarily what we're talking about. We're talking about the immigration system. There's also the fact that DHS has been a part, along with DOJ, in doing things like targeting mosques, targeting Muslims after 9/11, in many cases, curtailing civil liberties, creating violence in communities where it wasn't before. So there's a lot of both racist and violent sort of practice that has been a part of DHS since its inception. And so the best answer to that is to dismantle some of these things and start over again with an immigration system that is actually humane and makes sense, and start over again without targeting certain communities just based on their religion or the color of their skin.
Yeah, and I guess part of the reason why so many people are coming to the United States is US militarism abroad, which has quite often had highly negative effects in places like Central America. But I think that is a discussion for another time. Lindsay Koshgarian, thank you very much for joining us on the MintCast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Alan.
Yeah, where can people follow your work?
You can see our work at website, which is www.nationalpriorities.org.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, this show is made possible by supporters like you. If you have made it to the end here, let me just give a quick plug for our yearly funding drive on Indiegogo. As we face suppression on all sorts of platforms and there's the general crackdown on anti-war watchdog journalism continues, we ask you to support us by helping us with our yearly funding drive, as I said, on Indiegogo. The link will be down below. If you're not in an economic position to do so, you can still help us by reviewing us on whatever podcast platform you're watching on, or give us a like or subscribe on YouTube or wherever else you're watching this. Until next time, stay fresh.